Okay, our next presenter is Alexis Braun. Her presentation is Breathing Together, the Collaborative Spirit and Subversive Politics of Hilma at off Klint's Visionary Art. Alexis, an artist and interdisciplinary researcher, holds a BFA in studio arts and an MA in philosophy and religions. She is a PhD student in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, researching integral artistry as catalyst for political and cultural transformation. Please welcome Alexis. Okay. Great. In 2018, Hilma af Klint erupted onto the world stage with Paintings for the Future, the record-breaking exhibition at New York's Guggenheim Museum, a Frank Lloyd Wright masterpiece envisioned as a temple of spirit. Her rise to prominence invites reflection on the cultural milieu that enabled this once unknown artist to resonate so profoundly in the public sphere, raising broader questions about how social imaginaries evolve to include previously marginalized figures. Charles Taylor's elaboration of the modern social imaginary offers a compelling framework for understanding how the shifting cultural landscape made possible the widespread celebration of af Klint's visionary oeuvre. Her reception prompts timely questions. Does this surge of interest point to the simultaneously eternal and prescient nature of her revelatory vision? Do her symbolic images offer something akin to a transcendent experience within our disenchanted secular culture? Might her paintings serve as a form of translation, a rendering of the language of the cosmos? Or perhaps af Klint's imagery offers something more nuanced, a momentary reprieve from the uncertainties of our time, a liminal space where new ideas can begin to take root. Her images function as numinous portals, thresholds for exploring metaphysical possibilities. When af Klint died in 1944, she left behind an impressive collection of 1,600 works, including 24 notebooks spanning 26,000 pages. These documents provide extensive insight into her thoughts, processes, and spiritual cosmology, including the visionary directive that her work remain unseen for 20 years following her death. Having the insight to know that the social imaginary of her day was unable to receive what she had to offer, she sent her work into the future. This paper moves beyond formalist frameworks that reduce af Klint's oeuvre to questions of artistic primacy or influence, approaches that often reinforce colonial and patriarchal epistemologies rooted in linear models of innovation. Ripe with symbolic resonance, her images transcend the binaries of conventional aesthetics, skillfully weaving a web between the earthbound and the cosmic. I argue that af Klint's work calls for an epistemological framework attuned to its subversive potential, one that recognizes a cosmology and creative process interwoven with marginalized ways of knowing. Such a perspective not only challenges normative academic models, but also expands the cultural imaginary by reasserting the legitimacy of participatory, metaphysical, and symbolically mediated epistemologies. Recent discoveries suggest that af Klint collaborated with as many as 12 other women, a narrative that challenges the patriarchal myth of the solitary genius. Yet dismantling that myth is only one thread in an expanding story. I suggest that af Klint's vision of integral artistry is not only grounded in collaborative practice that disrupts dominant models of authorship, but also exemplifies the reunification of art, science, and spirituality, shaped by esoteric insight and cosmological imagination. Paintings for the Temple, a sequence of 193 works across 14 series, is the fruit of communal practice and collective discovery. Visually arresting, these images also pose profound ontological and epistemological questions. Conceived in communion with a constellation of female artists and what Klint took to be spiritual beings, this series positions her not only as a visionary artist, but as a spiritual visionary, inviting a rethinking of the boundaries between art, knowledge, and the evolution of consciousness. The word conspire derives from the Latin conspirare, meaning to breathe together, and by extension, to harmonize or unite in purpose. This etymology grounds the collaborative processes of Klint and her co-conspirators as meaningful generative acts, resisting the divisive forces that too often work to unravel the moral and social fabric of communal life. For Taylor, the social imaginary refers to the ways everyday people envision their world through images, stories, and shared cultural symbols, rather than abstract philosophical frameworks. These imaginaries emerge from the broader public, shaping communal practices through a shared sense of legitimacy. Klint's emergence signals a shift in the social imaginary, opening space for participatory, spiritually attuned ways of knowing. While not overtly political, her life and work speak to the multidimensionality of the human condition, embodying both the intrinsic need for community and the impulse towards transformative knowledge. Klint's practice suggests that art rooted in interdependence and spiritual inquiry can subtly subvert dominant epistemologies and cultural paradigms. When severed from the relational and epistemic depths, art risks becoming merely decorative or mimetic, untethered from its ontological and transformative potential. Amid today's social fragmentation and political divisiveness, Klint's work offers a compelling counter-narrative, rooted in friendship and co-creative ritual that serves as a potent antidote to the erosion of communal bonds in our era of polycrisis, a kind of elixir for our spiritual drought. Although A Secular Age offers a sweeping account of the secularization of the modern West, Taylor leaves critical stones unturned, namely the undercurrents of Western esotericism and the pervasiveness of patriarchal consciousness. To address these gaps, I introduce greater complexity through marginalized epistemologies. In doing so, I complicate Taylor's dichotomy of enchantment and disenchantment, a core structural binary shaping our social imaginaries, and affirm Klint's integral artistry as both inhabiting and subverting the paradox through modern spiritual practices rooted in esoteric lineages. Catherine Keller provides a penetrating critique of the gendered foundations of Western thought. She writes, quote, "Landscape is always becoming inscape," end quote. And the landscape of the modern West, cloaked in the veneer of patriarchal consciousness, has long been showing its cracks. Keller exposes the insidious implications of gender-based power structures on the formation of selfhood, relationality, and consciousness. Her analysis sheds light on how Klint reimagined what it meant in her time to be a woman, an artist, and a self. Revealing how the entanglement of separatism and sexism has shaped Western conceptions of subjectivity, Keller addresses the enduring tension between individuality and relationality. She challenges the false binary of self versus relations, arguing that relationality need not imply dependency. Rather, it can sustain and deepen one's sense of freedom. Klint and her co-conspirators embodied the vitality of this generative relationality, offering a living expression of Keller's image of webbed consciousness, a relational mode of being that resists the binary and hierarchical logic of hegemonic frameworks. Keller provides a striking image of this paradigm. Quote, "The heroic culture known for its dissemination of dichotomies requires perpetual decapitations. It specializes in the business of separating heads from bodies, especially when it confronts women of power. It is not clear that creative selfhood can survive the act of dichotomy, literally cutting in two." This visceral metaphor reveals the inherent violence embedded in patriarchal consciousness. Klint's Creative Cosmos, in dialogue with Keller's critique of Western separatism, offers a participatory vision that subverts normative hierarchical binaries, positioning her collaborative practices as catalysts for social and spiritual transformation. Defying formalist constraints and exceeding the bounds of conventional spiritual practice, her oeuvre transcends reductive aesthetic readings, advancing vital contributions to arts-based research and collective discovery. A thorough exploration of Klint's integral artistry calls for an alchemy of intellectual rigor and imaginative inquiry, an approach that preserves the full epistemic and spiritual potency of her work into the future. This requires dynamic interpretive frameworks that challenge the reductive categories often imposed on creativity, meaning-making, and rationality. Jacob Sherman argues that to meaningfully address questions of faith and reason requires global, critical approaches that challenge the presumed neutrality of dominant epistemologies by exposing their Western, patriarchal, and colonial biases. In response, he calls for the reevaluation of emic epistemologies, a movement that welcomes a culturally diverse understanding of rationality, particularly those rooted in non-Western or marginalized ways of knowing. An emic approach centers an insider's perspective, the practices and systems of belief that hold meaning for the subject in relation to the events in question. Sherman writes, quote, "Emic epistemologies do not determine what a subject takes to be true, but rather govern what a subject can regard as intelligible. At times, something more than what Western academia has considered truth, namely a kind of soteriological oneness with truth as realization. Interfacing with Klint's work through an emic lens requires a sincere and nuanced effort to understand how she and her collaborator sought knowledge from within their own situated perspectives and spiritual milieu. Though undeniably a Westerner, Klint's artistic practices operate outside the purview of dominant Western epistemic models, drawing from mystical, esoteric, and participatory ways of knowing that elude the limits of linguistic or formalist analysis. A post-colonial reevaluation of emic epistemologies brings into focus the challenge of Klint and others like her posed to inherited assumptions about artistic production, spirituality, and the ontological status of knowledge itself. At the same time, this lens reveals the transformative potential of marginalized ways of knowing to unsettle the presumed normativity of Western thought. Klint's participatory approach to knowledge, a process that gave birth to Paintings for the Temple, took shape during a seance in 1896 with the formation of a group with 4 other women called the Five. This marked the beginning of an extended period of collaboration in which the women meticulously recorded their spiritual experiences. As Julia Voss notes in her biography of Klint, quote, "The conversations of the Five were not ordinary. Messages from the high ones were understood to be truths, revelations of wisdom, and all 5 listeners knew that these communications required interpretation." An emic approach allows us to understand these practices not only as legitimate epistemological endeavors, but as deeply hermeneutic ones, grounded in a sustained commitment to receiving, interpreting, and stewarding what they believe to be revealed truths. As Sherman writes, "The reevaluation of emic and eidetic perspectives may be understood as part of the proliferation of new spiritual options that paradoxically abound under the sociological conditions of our supposedly secular modernity." Klint's work exemplifies this paradox, disrupting Taylor's dichotomy of enchantment and disenchantment by channeling spiritual insight through thoroughly modern artistic forms. Western esoteric systems like spiritualism, Rosicrucianism, theosophy, and anthroposophy, all practiced by Klint, often move like subterranean currents, quietly reshaping moral and social imaginaries. Marco Passi highlights the precarious status of esotericism, a fledgling field within religious studies still struggling for academic legitimacy. He situates this marginalization within a broader crisis facing the humanities, raising an urgent question: what might society become in their absence? Passi writes, the ambition of the humanities lies in believing that their cultivation can be helped with the construction of a better society, a society that learns from the mistakes of the past, understands the challenges of the present, and is imaginative enough to envision solutions for the future. This should be a society in which these activities are sufficiently transparent and collaborative, resulting in a shared, ever more inclusive effort towards improvement. Passi's concern echo Taylor's account for the social imaginary, underscoring the cultural transformation arises not from abstract frameworks enforced by elites, but from a shared sense of legitimacy rooted in communal practice. His work affirms the generative potential of the esoteric traditions embodied by Klint and her collaborators, traditions that cultivate the kind of radical thinking needed to resist the normative constraints of Western thought. Sherman's call to revalue emic epistemologies helps legitimize long marginalized fields like esotericism within serious interdisciplinary discourse. In conversation with Keller's critique of gendered binaries, this invites a radical expansion of epistemological frameworks, one that fuses imagination with intellectual rigor and exposes the power structures embedded in dominant ways of knowing. Together, these thinkers call for not just a revision, but a reimagining of the frameworks that shape our cultural, academic, and spiritual lives. In doing so, they demonstrate how Taylor's secularization narrative must be extended to include the spiritual, relational, and visionary forces subtly reshaping our social imaginaries. Through this widening perspective, Klint's life and work emerge as a visionary field guide for an evolving social imaginary, one that transcends the materialist techno-industrial paradigm by reviving a participatory vision of knowledge and affirming the ontological power of the living image in the evolution of consciousness. In closing, I leave you with a few questions. Though over a decade has passed since Klint's first solo retrospective, we now stand at an inflection point. The very conditions that enabled her cultural emergence are increasingly under threat. In a political climate marked by narrowing definitions of scholarly legitimacy, rising anti-intellectualism, and the defunding of the arts and humanities, I can't help but wonder, how are we to nurture a social imaginary capacious enough to recognize the insights of figures like Klint and her conspirators as legitimate ways of knowing? How do we not only protect the progress that allowed for her emergence, but also continue pressing against the epistemic limits of our time, especially amid mounting constraints on scholars, artists, and spiritual researchers alike? Elaine Scarry writes that the willingness to continually revise one's own location in order to place oneself in the path of beauty is the basic impulse underlying education. If this holds true, then the staggering beauty of Klint's work offers more than revelation. It offers reorientation, guidance for navigating the polycrisis of our time. Scarry, drawing a parallel to Plato's dialogues, reminds us that at the heart of the arts and sciences lies a foundational impulse, the eros to refine our understanding, to deepen clarity where there's already discernment, and to illuminate what remains unseen. In this way, educational institutions have a vital role to play in sustaining beauty by igniting the creative impulse for continual renewal, attuning to the fragile yet insistent whispers of Klint and her conspirators calling out to us across time. They call to us, on behalf of many, to deepen and defend these emergent fields, to reimagine a social imaginary generous enough to hold symbolic resonance, spiritual proliferation, and participatory ways of knowing as vital to the evolution of consciousness. Finally, Off Klint's legacy invites us to reconsider the roles of art, spirituality, and interdependence in not only the academic and cultural landscape, but the unfurling of consciousness itself. Her work summons us to breathe together, to conspire in imagining a future rooted in beauty, interconnectedness, and care. Thank you.